So, hopefully you're in the right class. We're going to be taking a look at the book of Zechariah this week. My main goal overall is to take a look at the exile and bigger issues, for instance, like redemption. It's a phenomenal topic when you stop to think of it because it spanned more than 500 years. It actually seeps into the New Testament. Brother Paul and John made reference to, James and Jude and Peter. They all make reference to the dispersion, the scattered, which happened in 587. So we're talking about something that affected many people, both in the Old Testament and New Testament. So it's very much a contemporary topic. Give me, for instance, we now live in what I would call the age of exile. Currently, there's about 100 million people in exile around the world, principally from countries like Syria, Venezuela, Sudan. Obviously, what happened in February 2022 with the Ukraine. A lot of kids were exiled, sent to Sweden and Poland. So it's very much a contemporary issue. Going back even in our countries, in North America, it's been a prevalent and interesting topic to say the least. For instance, I'll give you an example. The American Indians in 1492 numbered about 60 million in North America. Their numbers plummeted for various reasons. If you've traveled out west, you may have encountered the Trail of Tears. That covers 5,000 miles. And there wasn't Amtrak, airplanes, whatever. These people went by horses and by foot. It was exile in many respects, obviously within the borders and confines of the United States. I'll give you another example, Africans. So again, in the 15th century, the Middle Passage, about 15 African folks were transported across from Angola, Ghana, etc., about 8,000 miles across the ocean. About 1 out of 6 or 7 died en route. What was interesting about both these examples of exile, they've never gone back home. They never recovered what they lost in terms of wealth, family relations, communities, and it's just been very tragic and traumatic. This subject this week is related to that in the sense of you had a whole country of people that were just uprooted and exiled from their homeland, in some cases 500 to 900 miles away. It's a very apropos and applicable subject. What I found fascinating when I started looking at this was from a biblical perspective and from God's perspective, He's the God of all flesh. He's not a tribal God just of Israel, He's the God of all flesh. Point being this, if you flip over to the book of Amos, chapter 9, verse 7, he says, "Are you not like the Cushites to me, O people of Israel, declares the Lord? Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor or Crete, or the Syrians from Kir, which is eastern Iran?" In other words, he sees all. He feels people's pain. He's aware of what's going on in this creation. This story happens just to illustrate a unique circumstance in human history. It's perhaps not the worst case, but it does illustrate that God works in the affairs of people, and He gives us the blueprint of how to attain hope. So that's going to be a pivotal factor this week, is taking a look at hope. So my goal here is just to reinforce and encourage you guys about your hope, which is largely redemption. It's the hope of all people. We're all exiles in one way or another. You may not realize it, but none of us, your ancestors, were not born here. Even Indians, they came across the Bering Strait. Human beings are exiles. Right from the Garden of Eden onwards, we've been on the move. Nobody's at home in terms of being settled. So the class this week will focus on redemption and restoration, rebuilding. So I just don't want you to lose sight of the big picture here, what we're trying to accomplish here. Israel, there's something unique about this. They're one of the few nations or peoples that have actually returned back to their home place. Typically, you get washed up in the melting pot, you don't go back home, whether it's Angola, Ghana, Ukraine. That does not happen very often. So the Jewish people, that was quite unique in history of returning. Because basically all of them, one form or fashion, most of them, I should say, most of them were removed from the land physically. So without further ado, this book is talking about coming out of exile. And in many respects, all of us are all exiles, whether we realize it or not. Since the Garden of Eden, moved from there, we're not at home. We're not at our resting place. So we'll be taking a look at this example of how God works in human lives with people who are broken, who need to be rehabilitated, reformed, and strengthened. So just to give you some context, this is happening again in his time. They just come back from captivity after 70 years. So they came from, Babylon fell pretty quickly, and about 2 weeks later, Cyrus the Great says, hey, the Jewish people, you guys can go back home and start rebuilding your temple. The context here that I point out is 2 verses from Daniel. One's from Daniel 8:27, where he takes a look at the vision between the goat and the ram, that's between Greece and Persia, and he says he was appalled at the vision and he didn't understand it completely. The next verse is in Daniel 10, verses 1 and 2. He says he mourned for 3 weeks. Most of us don't mourn for 3 weeks even when your parents die. Like, that's a long time. And he says he was very troubled at these visions. The reason I put the slide up, you go to the book of Zechariah, there's a lot of stuff there that thinking, I don't understand it, I don't get the point. How is this relevant to me in the year 2023? So again, higher level, we're taking a look at concepts related to redemption that is applicable to every human being, right? As well as exile. So this is a very chaotic and interesting period in human history when wars were massive. Typically, the Persians especially had armies of over 1 million men, which back then was phenomenal. So that's the context in the book of Zechariah. It's at this time they're coming back from exile and trying to rebuild and restore what they had lost. The book is interesting in as much as it's got 8 visions. The book starts off with 8 visions. So for the first 6 chapters is dealing with that. And it's interesting, it takes a little detour. So in chapter 7, they send priests to ask Zechariah, how long should we fast over the destruction of Jerusalem? And then there's 4 fasts they engage in, dealing with both what we will call the destruction of the temple, as well as other things related to their situation. And then they ask the question about unclean food and dietary things. Both he and Haggai deal with that issue. And then the book deals with high-level issues about God's going to bless Israel in chapter 8, and he talks about their future and their destiny, and sort of encouraging them that all's not lost and it's not bleak. And then finally, the last 5 chapters deal with messages of hope, namely victory and redemption. So just to keep it simple, again, 8 visions that I'll cover in depth tomorrow. There's 4 messages: rebuke, reminder, restoration, and return. And again, you've just come home. Basically, most of the parents died, so it's the kids and the grandkids who came home being 500 miles away in Babylon. So he gives them upbuilding messages. He rebukes some of the people, their leaders, who let them down. And then finally, he leaves them, and this seems counterintuitive to some, but messages of hope and support. You're in a time of trouble, but we'll get through this. And God is in the business of rehabilitating and restoring and rebuilding lives, and that's what he does with that generation. Zechariah's name means God remembers, and that's the thing I want you to remember when you leave here. God doesn't forget about people, however small or insignificant it is, or you think you are. God remembers people. He remembers promises, and he remembers pledges, and he remembers what he's promised us. So that's what we're going to focus on, is God remembering. So a lot of this, the backdrop is the history of Israel. They witnessed over 22 miracles in the wilderness. They just witnessed a lot of phenomenal things. And ironically, if you go to the minor prophets, Israel ends up forgetting. They forget about God. They forget about what's going on. They lived for the moment. It was basically carpe diem on steroids. They weren't worried about the future. They just lived for the moment. So that's the contrast you see. It's juxtaposed. You see, God remembers, Israel forgets. It's like you and I. God remembers, I forget. So my goal this week is just to encourage you, don't forget. Remember, God remembers. He wants you to remember. He's given you great promises and great hope. Don't lose sight of that and don't lose hold of it. So his family tree, both his father and his family, they went into, his grandfather and his father went into exile in Babylon. His grandfather's name is Iddo. It means his witness. Berechiah, his father, means Yah blesses. And Zechariah's name means Yah remembers. This is ultimately a story about a family. So a story about a nation, a story about a family, a story about a man. I'm specifically going to focus on two men this week. The high priest, his name was Joshua, and the prince, his name is Zerubbabel. In Ezra chapter 1 and 2, he's also called Sheshbazzar. That was his Persian name. Zerubbabel was his Babylonian name. So it throws some people off, but that's what's going on there with his name. So obviously there's 14 chapters and 211 verses. There's no way I can tackle all of that this week. So I want to give you the main meat of the matter, main four topics. So the Jewish people, the nation of Judah, and Jerusalem. You can see how concentric this gets. It just drills down. And obviously, it deals in chapter 3 with the man Joshua, the high priest, who is, again, the forerunner of Jesus. We'll see the relationship there. So I'm going to take a look at this from a more topical, thematical approach. So you're asking the question, well, what can I get from this? How's it applicable to me? We're very much in a period similar to them. We live in a world that writers now call the digital Babylon. We've had major hammering. And this is what happened in their time. Most of the people did not want to go back. Like more than 80% stayed in Babylon. They thought, you know what, life's pretty good here. Why do I want to go back there? We've seen similar phenomenon, not just our church. Nearly every denomination in North America has had similar issues. Empty churches, wounded hearts, empty pews. Millennials aren't listening. People have abandoned their faith. It's like a football game. We're at halftime here. You've got to recalibrate and come up with a different game plan. Anybody a football fan? So remember the 2017 Super Bowl? Atlanta's winning 21-3 at halftime. And you're thinking, oh, New England doesn't stand a chance, except for Joni. She knew they would come back. But they're thinking, Bill Belichick had to come up with a new game plan at halftime. It's similar to us. It's a game in some respects. It's physical combat. You've got to change your strategies to deal with the reality of the situation facing you. You can't keep employing the same strategies and anticipate to solve the problem. That's what happened in his time, in Zerubbabel and Joshua's time. They had to do things differently. So I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from this, and we'll see there's a lot of similarities and commonalities that we'll see. Gotcha. I need a body mic. So here's what happened. Again, this is for hundreds of years, 500 years plus, that they were in exile, scattered throughout all of Asia Minor. So the early church initially was largely Jewish converts. They had a significant impact on synagogues. I think John mentioned that this morning about the number of synagogues in Galilee. There was like 50. It was significant. They brought a lot to the table. It really did strengthen the faith. And they had a unique perspective that, like a Plato wouldn't give you, Aristotle wouldn't give you. But a Paul or a Barnabas, they would give them unique perspectives. All these guys were Jewish believers. As one writer put it, the great people, the Jews of God's choice, were soon least adequately recognized in the Catholic or Universal Church. And that's what he meant by that, was all Christian denominations. He said that was a disaster to the church itself. It meant that the church as a whole failed to understand the Old Testament. That's 80% of the Bible. It's hard to figure out the puzzle if you don't understand 80% of the material. And the Greek mind and the Roman mind in turn took over. It dominated the early church. So basically every first principle, the thing we believe, was influenced by early Greek thought. Basically, it was Platonic. And he states, this is a disaster that the early church never recovered from, either in doctrine or practice. We owe a lot to that generation of Jewish believers. They basically cemented the hope of Israel. So to give you an example, largely a lot of the Bible deals with the exile or the post-exile. So this week we're going to take a look largely at Zechariah, but also Haggai, and obviously Esther's at this time frame, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. All in the space of about 60 years. These 6 individuals figure prominently. Even before that, as I mentioned earlier, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel figure prominently. It was a huge influence both on the Bible and the hope of Jewish Judeo-Christianity. My goal this week is to strengthen your faith. There's a lot of things under attack, so to speak. I'm trying to instill confidence in the Word of God, the Bible, that it's trustworthy, it's reliable, and it's the foundation of our faith. So this is, I asked a couple people, hey, what do you think about Zerubbabel? And they thought I was talking about some guy from outer space. We've got a lot to learn from these people. As this one writer put it, he says, our first impression as we begin to read the book of Zechariah may be one of remoteness, of distance from us. However, we need to bear in mind 2 things. We ought not to view Zechariah and his contemporaries as representatives of an alien race, but as our spiritual ancestors who knew and served the same God as we do. The whole book is governed by the vision of the coming of the kingdom of God. The latter chapters, chapter 12, 13, and 14, deal with that. But his point was this. He said, the title of his book, Bruce Barry Webb, was The Messages of Zechariah, Your Kingdom Come. One of the pinnacle verses in the book is in chapter Zechariah 9, verse 9, behold, your king, the Messiah. We have a lot to learn from these people in the sense of their perspectives that we've lost over the course of hundreds of years to our detriment. A lot of the book of Zechariah deals with messianic prophecies. It significantly impacts our understanding both of the Gospel of Matthew as well as the book of Revelation. You can have lunch with Brother Norm Fidel and he'll fill you in on that. So again, a lot of messianic prophecies about Jesus that are rooted in the book of Zechariah, which is interesting because at his time, they had no king. One of their last kings was Zedekiah. They killed both of his sons in front of him, and then they plucked out his eyes. They lost their temple, they lost their land, they lost their families. It was horrific. So when Matthew comes on the scene, he's trying to rebuild their faith. So we'll take a look at some of the connections to the Gospel of Matthew. The book of Zechariah has often been called the apocalypse of the Old Testament. It makes use of a lot of figurative and symbolic language. At times, its statements are quite brief and succinct. I feel like Daniel in some respects. I'm thinking, I really don't understand this vision. And sometimes you're appalled at some of the language. Is that really literal? Is that going to happen? So the goal this week is I can't answer all the questions. You can't answer all the questions. But we can take more baby steps towards understanding a fuller perspective of the gospel. So the key adage here is the glory of God to conceal a matter, to search out a matter is the glory of kings. That's our goal here, is to search out. You're not going to ever find all the answers. As Herman Opitz once said, the more you know, the less you know. So the goal here is just to learn a little bit more to fill in the blanks. So it's a very eschatological book, apocalyptic. It's truly the most messianic book of the minor prophets, the 12 minor prophets. And this may seem counterintuitive. The whole point of the book was to offer hope and encouragement in troublesome times. And it was troublesome times. Jerusalem was basically just almost burnt to the ground. The temple was gone. That was the core of their religious society and communities. So no temple. Their homes were abandoned and wrecked. The wall around Jerusalem was in rubble for 80 years. They were in a bad place. So this book is designed to encourage people, don't give up the fight. We can overcome. Isaiah, this is a little bit before this time frame, but he says, you were tired out by the length of your road, yet you did not say it's hopeless. You found renewed strength, therefore you did not faint. That's the goal of Zechariah, is to renew our strength, that we don't say it's useless, hopeless, and just give up and stop walking. Certainly one of the key tenets in the Old Testament, and you see this very vividly and poignantly in the book of Zechariah, is the Old Testament treats Israel history in terms of her faithfulness or disobedience to the covenant. And if you read the book of Lamentations, it's 154 verses. I read it all in one fell swoop. I think, this is very depressing. It was heartbreaking. The point is there is God can help us to get through tough times. When it seems like all hope is lost, we still can recover and be restored. Think about that just as individuals. You know, you just make some bad choices in life and you think, oh, this is great, it's over. But it never is. He can help us if we're patient. Noah Webster, who's really the father of American education, he said, the history of the Jews presents the true character of man in all its forms. He wrote this in a little succinct book. It's about 35 pages. And I thought, you know what, you're right. They're no better, no worse than the rest of us. Supposed to learn from them, thinking, oh, what do we learn vicariously from this example of their history? What do I learn from the book of Zechariah? So the goal here this week is to help you to sort of read the signs on the wall, the handwriting on the wall. Because the poignant lesson here is a generation that fails to read the signs of the times may be forced to read the writing on the wall. I'm almost positive these guys were fundamentally shaken up when the Babylonians took them into exile. So when they get back, they were released in 538. So for the first couple of years, they're working feverishly and good stuff was happening. Then there was a lot of adversity and arguments from their adversaries and opponents and enemies. So everybody just put down their trowels and they stopped working for 18 years. So by the year 520, which is where we're going to focus on this week, as one writer says, it was the year 520 was one of crisis for Jerusalem. It was not the kind of crisis obvious to all, as when a threat of invasion shocks a whole population into action. You see that with the Ukraine last year. But rather, the dangerous state of moral paralysis, which accepts as normal conditions that demand drastic changes. Unless a man of vision and determination can intervene, there's no hope for recovery. Joyce Baldwin's essentially saying they got lulled into a sense of false security, and they were ill-equipped to deal with the tragedy and the crisis at their feet. But she says, a person of vision and determination can make a fundamental difference. Just one person, and that's for each of us. The people in your circle of life you can impact. Another writer wrote the last sentence here in blue. It says, the 8 night visions of Zechariah, which were given in one night, February 15th, 519. It even has that date in the book. It gives precise dates. 8 visions. Thinking, whoa, you'll see the significance of that in a minute. But most of these visions confront the issues that the early post-exilic community was faced with. These aren't obscure, mystical visions. They were very relevant to those people in their everyday lives. So it wasn't your average night of dreams. There was 8 dreams that night. The average person may have 3 to 4 or 5. I timed myself. I read all 8 visions. It takes about 8 minutes. Most people never take 8 minutes in their life to read this. It's got significant impact on everyday life in the sense of where you're headed with faith and what God's plan in your life. So again, 8 visions. We'll take a look at these later on this week. They all had relevance to life for these early returnees from Babylon and Persia. The beautiful thing about this, it's almost like spiritual DNA. At a subatomic level, there's a lot of pattern that most English speakers you just don't get. When I first read Zechariah, I'm thinking, okay, I'm not sure what this is about. and then you move on to Malachi. You just don't step back and think, okay, what's going on here? What's the lay of the land here? What's the patterns here? What's the perspective? Once you start taking a look, oh, God's telling the people, as Paul says in Romans 11:3, has God rejected Israel? And he says, absolutely not. Zechariah said, I'm reminding you guys that God's still at work. We may not see it necessarily, but he's at work both to protect us and to bless us and to help us to overcome. And then at the pinnacle of the book, where both these lines of argument intersect, is a prophecy about a king and a priest who would wear both crowns. They need a savior. The Hebrew word is translated as mighty God in Isaiah 9 verse 6, actually means mighty hero, divine hero, a very strong hero. And that's what the Messiah would be, is a divine hero. And the latter part of the book deals with angels at work, ultimately to remove sin and the vestiges of sin from their society. There's about 54 passages of Zechariah quoted in 67 different places in the New Testament. It's pretty prevalent. It figures very prominently both in the book of Revelation and in the book of the Gospel of Matthew. So Babylon, the Bible actually doesn't talk a lot about Babylon. It just says, it's, from a material and a commercial perspective, it was significant. But it was basically the birthplace of idolatry. Unclean spirits, demons, unclean birds, unclean and detestable beasts. That's the world in which Jews who were adversely opposed to any kind of idolatry until about 100 years before their exile, this is the world in which they were taken into. He says, if you want idolatry, okay, you guys are going to get it. So Zechariah comes along and says, you know what, let's get out of here, let's go back home. So the exhortation was to flee from Babylon and escape to Zion. So it was a significant event in Jewish history, was the return of Jewish exiles from Babylon back to the land of promise. But you can see on this map, hopefully, how small their country had become when they came back from exile. It's Yehud, which means Jewish, Medina, Nada. It was a very small stake of land compared to the old kingdom. What's going on at this time in their history? During Haggai, who came to Jerusalem about 4 months before Zechariah, so they're contemporaries. His is a small book, it's 2 chapters. He says, is it time for you guys to live in paneled houses while this house of God lies in ruins? Because of my house that lies in ruins, well, each of you busies himself with his own house. They were focused on the here and now. They thought, you know what, we've lost 70 years, we can't get back. So they just started building beautiful homes to the exclusion of the temple of God. That's easy to happen for all of us. You can just focus on your stuff and not God's building. And we see what can happen. As I think Paul was saying, we've got decay around us, and decay doesn't stop. It's like tooth decay. It just gets worse and worse. And that's the problem with decay. If we just focus on ourselves in this little spot, everything else goes downhill. So, as one writer put it, when Haggai calls upon Zerubbabel and Joshua and the people to consider their ways, he uses a familiar metaphor, a path. It's the Hebrew word derek, which generally connotes that which is trodden underfoot. These people were desperately poor, most of them. So they come back basically with a shirt on their back. And he's saying, you guys got to have a bigger vision. It's not about you, it's about community. So when Zerubbabel, he's the perfect leader. He's you would call a working supervisor. He lays the foundation stone. He finishes the building. This guy was amazing. And he's leading the way to restore Jerusalem. The problem is this, and we still encounter the same problem. This is a little later in history, about 40 years after this. In Nehemiah's time, it says, the people of Judah began to complain. The workers were getting tired, because when the priests came back, only about 16% of them came back. The other 84% stayed in Persia. I'm not going back there. I got life. Life is good here. Remember Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 5 to 7 says, hey, when you're there, marry, get businesses, grow your life. But he did caution and says, it's not going to be all it is. You still have to come back. And they didn't do that. But 80% of them stayed in Persia. So the small remnant, and that's the word it uses through the minor prophets, the small remnant that came back, that was a rather daunting task. As they said, the workers are getting tired. There's so much rubble to be moved. We will never be able to build the wall by ourselves. Does that sound familiar? We got just hit by COVID so bad, a lot of ecclesias lost 50% or more people. When you lose that kind of capital resource and investments, it's hard to keep momentum. People get discouraged. And that's what happened during the time of Zerubbabel, Joshua, and Nehemiah, and Ezra. So the exhortation that Zechariah gives to Zerubbabel and Joshua and the people is, be strong, Zerubbabel. Be strong, Joshua. Be strong, all people of the land. Why? Because I, the Lord, work. I am with you. According to the covenant that I made with you when I came out of Egypt, my spirit remains in your midst. That's Paul's talking about that, right? It didn't go away, it just didn't vanish. He says, I'm still here. I'm still your God. Fear not. And when he makes that statement, that was about 900 years earlier. He's making reference to something that happened 900 years ago about God rescuing them out of Egypt. And Jesus picks up on the same language. I think it evokes the same message that Haggai gives the people. Jesus says, take courage, I am he, fear not. Time to time, we're all filled with trouble. We're all filled with fear. That's natural and understandable. Brother John's talking about that in his first class. We've got to come up with a different set of tools and a different mindset to deal with trouble and fear. Just to give you a backdrop here, and that's why I sort of got to cross-reference and cross-pollinate across the board, whether it's Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah. Ezra says that all who trembled at the words of the God of Israel because of the faithlessness of the returned exile gathered around. While I was sat appalled until the evening sacrifice. When he surveyed the landscape, he said, what the heck are we doing? We made promises to each other. It's like a man or a woman make promises to each other in marriage. And they basically just walked away. And he's appalled at what's happening. But his sentiment just didn't stop with being appalled. He said, okay, we got to do something here. We got to get back to our roots, our foundation, whether it's evening sacrifice, reading, so on and so forth. But that's the climate here and the context in Zechariah. So the book starts off, and it doesn't mince words. It's not a love letter, so to speak, in that respect. God basically says, you know what, I was really ticked off with your fathers. And as John says, he doesn't say, you guys go home and think about it for a while. Just lay on your bed and think about it. He says, I want you to return. Essentially, this is a whole meta-narrative of the prodigal son. The whole Bible is basically, come back home. I want you home. As bad as you think it is, I can work with it. He says, don't be like your fathers. Don't give up. So how bad was the Babylonian exile? The cursory thought is, it was really bad. They were happy to get out of there. The truth of the matter was, and they found this out about 10 years ago, they found all these clay tablets. They were reporting and journaling what was going on. Life was actually pretty good for them. That's why they didn't go back. It sort of reminds me of that comment that Paul makes in 2 Timothy 4:10. He says, Demas loved this present world, therefore he's departed from me. That's true of all of us. I get very comfortable in this present world. Life is good. I'm thinking, I'm not sure I want to make that sacrifice. That's the problem we all face. We lose sight of the big picture where we're headed, i.e. the promised land. So many of the towns in southern Judah and Simeon were not occupied after the exile. This proves clearly that the Babylonian invasion was quite as disastrous as portrayed in the Old Testament. Basically, people did not go back home. These homes were basically vacant for more than 70 years. As one writer put it, evidently it was a token return. But Ezra, chapter 2, verse 64, 65 says about 50,000 people came back. There was a lot more that did not come back. And he says, we know that a large number of Jews were flourishing in the Babylonian community under the tolerant Persian regime. Life was good, and they did not go back. The problem was, when they died, their faith died with them, and their families, the communities just eroded. Ultimately, it's more than just about you and me. So fortunately, two men stood up on the plate and helped them. Zerubbabel, who is called the prince, he was the governor. He was in exile from Babylon. His grandfather died in the course of the invasion of Jerusalem in 587. He was a remarkable civic leader. As I said, he was both a doer and a leader. He led by example. Joshua was a phenomenal man. He was the high priest. He was also very poor. But he came back sort of analogous to Hebrews 11:29, where it says, Moses chose to suffer affliction with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. That's the choice we all have. Life's good here for this little split second, as Todd Smoke would say, 3 minutes. That's it. You got to have a bigger vision. And so Joshua and Zerubbabel are there to bring that vision to life. So I'm going to conclude with this thought. Because I asked several people who were Bible students for 40, 50 years, I said, what do you think about Zerubbabel? And they looked at me like I was talking about the 1963 Green Bay Packers, like they had no idea. Zerubbabel's a pinnacle player in the Old Testament. He's smack dab in the middle of the genealogies of Jesus. To give you an example, the chart in your book is rather convoluted. I thought, that's not simple enough to get the point across. I thought, I got to make this real simple. So those generations spanned like 14 generations. There's 4 names in common in both the genealogy of Joseph and the genealogy of Mary. It's David, Zerubbabel, Joseph, and Jesus. Those are the 4 names that are the only 4 names that are in common with both genealogies. I found that fascinating. The writer's obviously going out of his way to, and he quotes this 3 times in the New Testament, that Jesus is a descendant of the seed of David. Smack dab in the middle of this is Zerubbabel. He's the linchpin to keep the hope alive, the hope of Israel, i.e. the Messiah. What's interesting, both, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, both Zerubbabel and Jesus had stepfathers, so to speak. In Zerubbabel's case, his father was named Shealtiel, but he died childless. So his wife married his brother, Pedaiah, in 1 Chronicles 3:15. But his biological father was Pedaiah, but his birthright father or legal father was Shealtiel. But he always refers to himself as the son of Shealtiel. So if you're not on your game, you're thinking, okay, that's who his birth father. But I wasn't. They're both stepsons. What's interesting about Joseph, he's described as being, his father's name was Joseph. He was described in the New Testament as the son of David. But in Luke's genealogy, it stems from Mary. Her father was named Heli. And Joseph is described as Heli, of Heli. So he wasn't begotten by Heli. He didn't have 2 fathers that way. Somehow, some way, Heli either adopted him or somehow he came into the family fold. So Joseph and Mary are pivotal, obviously, in the birth of Jesus. But both lines of their families intersected at Joseph, which I find fascinating. And we'll see that later this week, how these individuals come into play in the big picture. So to wrap up, this one gentleman said, I commonly say that the most exciting sentence in the history of human literature, I calculated one time, there's 169 books in the Library of Congress. I'm thinking the most exciting sentence in the history of human literature is Matthew 1:1. Really? And he says, some are surprised to hear this, considering that Matthew 1:1 is the beginning of a genealogy. It's like, wake me up when it's over. But the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, how can that be exciting? This guy, his name is Nick Petrowski. He's the major writer on the deportation of Jews from exile. And his point was, this genealogy, there's something that's significant to our hope. So again, as I mentioned, 4 times it mentions about the deportation to Babylon or from Babylon in the genealogy of Jesus. He wants us to be familiar with the exile. It formed 500 years after the fact. It was still important and significant to early Christians, Jewish Christians and beyond. So I'll end with these two verses, because the hope that they all had was the hope of a Messiah who would bring them comfort and deliverance, who would bring them redemption, namely a man who would sit on the throne of David. And when Jesus is born, that's their pronouncement. Jesus will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. In his kingdom there will be no end. So to wrap up, today we took a look at an introduction to some of the main characters here. There's Joshua and Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zechariah. So the context of 520, it was a challenging time, but Zechariah was there to stabilize the situation and to reinvigorate their hope. And so we took a little bit about the structure, and we'll pick up on that tomorrow. But as I start to uncover these gems, hopefully it strengthens and invigorates your faith. This isn't dry, musty, dusty history. It's got relevance to all of us as to God's working in the lives of people. These people were all poor and thinking that they were without hope, but he reminds them through Zechariah, it's not hopeless. Let's not give up. Let's keep building. And that's the exhortation for us.